Some American towns were built around gold, railroads, or rivers. These 9 were built for one purpose: war. Thousands of people arrived, streets appeared almost overnight, and entire communities rose in places where almost no one had lived before. But when the threat disappeared, the government packed up, the people vanished, and nature began taking everything back. One of these places trained the soldiers who inspired America's modern ski industry. Another prepared the aircraft that dropped the first atomic bomb. But the strangest of all was invaded by more than 34,000 troops after the enemy had already escaped. Far off the coast of Florida stands a 6-sided fortress, so enormous that it seems impossible to abandon. Fort Jefferson covers 16 acres of Garden Key in the Dry Tortugas, roughly 70 miles west of Key West. Construction began in 1846 because the United States needed to protect the shipping routes through the Gulf of Mexico. So engineers designed a colossal stronghold with more than 16 million bricks and room for about 2,000 people. But the location that made Fort Jefferson strategically valuable also made it miserable. Fresh water was scarce, hurricanes battered the walls, and salt air corroded almost everything. During the Civil War, Union troops held the fort and used it as a military prison. Its most famous inmate was Dr. Samuel Mudd, convicted of helping John Wilkes Booth after the assassination of Abraham Lincoln. The fort was never completed. The Army largely abandoned it in 1874, leaving behind empty gun rooms, crumbling brickwork, and a moat filled with clear blue water. Today, visitors arrive by boat or seaplane, but after the last ferry leaves, the giant fortress becomes quiet enough to hear the wind moving through its corridors. More than 2,500 miles west, another military settlement rose beside a river in Nevada. Fort Churchill was established in 1860 after conflict erupted between settlers and the Northern Paiute. At its peak, the post contained adobe barracks, officers' quarters, workshops, a hospital, and enough activity to make it feel like a small frontier town. But Fort Churchill's life was measured in years, not generations. Soldiers guarded mail routes, protected travelers, and watched the surrounding territory as the Civil War created new fears about communication with the West. Yet once those routes became more secure, the Army no longer needed the post. It was abandoned in 1869, only 9 years after it opened. Local residents removed wood from the buildings, but the thick adobe walls remained. Rain slowly rounded their edges, so the ruins now look less like military architecture and more like structures melting back into the desert. The place reveals a pattern that appears again and again. Washington could create a community quickly, but it had little reason to preserve one after its mission ended. That pattern became even harsher at Fort Bowie in southeastern Arizona. The fort was established in 1862 near Apache Pass, where a reliable spring made the route vital to soldiers, mail carriers, and travelers. The United States wanted control of the pass, but Chiricahua Apache leaders, including Cochise and later Geronimo, resisted military expansion into their homeland. A second, larger Fort Bowie was built in 1868. It eventually included dozens of structures, among them barracks, homes, warehouses, corrals, and a hospital. Families lived there, children played between the buildings, and stagecoaches passed through the nearby station. But the ordinary details hid the fort's real purpose. It existed because of a violent struggle over land, movement, and survival. Geronimo surrendered in 1886, so the military justification for Fort Bowie rapidly weakened. The Army abandoned it in 1894. Roofs collapsed, walls crumbled, and the desert reclaimed the roads. Visitors must now walk about 3 miles round trip to reach the ruins. That isolation matters, because Fort Bowie is not simply an empty settlement. It is the remains of a campaign that changed the Southwest forever. Decades later, America began building military towns on a completely different scale. High in the Colorado Rockies, at an elevation of roughly 9,200 feet, Camp Hale appeared in 1942. The Army needed troops who could fight in deep snow and extreme cold, so it created a mountain city for the 10th Mountain Division. Camp Hale had more than 1,000 buildings, and could accommodate around 15,000 people. It included barracks, hospitals, mess halls, warehouses, theaters, and recreation facilities. Soldiers trained on skis, climbed icy slopes, slept in freezing conditions, and learned to move artillery through terrain that seemed designed to stop an army. But Camp Hale also produced an unexpected civilian legacy. Veterans of the 10th Mountain Division returned after World War II with expert skiing skills and a love of the mountains. Many helped develop American ski resorts, including major destinations such as Vail. So a temporary war camp quietly helped transform winter recreation in the United States. The Army closed Camp Hale in 1945. Most buildings disappeared, but foundations, roads, and pieces of military infrastructure remained scattered across the valley. The men had trained there for combat in Italy, yet the place they left behind became a strange bridge between war and leisure. In Louisiana, the military built something even larger. Camp Claiborne opened in 1939 on approximately 23,000 acres of pine forest. Roads were cut through the trees, barracks rose in long rows, and the population surged into the tens of thousands. At times, around 50,000 people could be stationed there, making the camp larger than many permanent American towns. Camp Claiborne played a major role in the Louisiana maneuvers, enormous exercises that tested how the United States Army might fight a modern, mobile war. The 82nd Division was reactivated there in 1942, but military planners soon split its airborne forces, helping create the 82nd Airborne and the 101st Airborne Divisions. That means some of the units later associated with Normandy and the liberation of Europe passed through a temporary wooden city in Louisiana. But speed had shaped the camp, so permanence never mattered. Buildings were cheap, utilities were basic, and almost everything existed only for the emergency. The camp closed after the war. Structures were sold or dismantled, vegetation swallowed the streets, and the huge population evaporated. Today, a person can stand among the trees with little sense that tens of thousands of soldiers once filled the same ground. Nearby Camp Livingston followed an equally dramatic rise and fall. Built in 1940, it covered roughly 47,000 acres north of Alexandria, Louisiana. It became one of the largest training centers in the region, with barracks, hospitals, chapels, stores, and theaters serving a population that could exceed 50,000. But Livingston carried a darker secret. The camp also held prisoners of war from Germany and Italy, while a separate internment facility confined civilians of Japanese ancestry. So the same place that prepared Americans to fight authoritarian regimes overseas also reflected fear and injustice at home. When the war ended, Camp Livingston closed almost immediately. Lumber was salvaged, buildings vanished, and roads dissolved beneath the forest. Its disappearance feels complete, but that is exactly why it matters. A place can be physically erased, while the choices made there continue to shape how a country remembers itself. At Wendover, on the Utah-Nevada border, the empty landscape hides a direct connection to the atomic age. Wendover Army Airfield expanded rapidly during World War II because the surrounding desert offered enormous space for bombing practice. At its peak, the base supported roughly 20,000 military personnel and civilians. But in late 1944, Colonel Paul Tibbets arrived with the 509th Composite Group. Its mission was so secret that most people at Wendover did not know what the unit was preparing to do. Crews trained with specially modified B-29 bombers and practiced dropping enormous test weapons shaped like the atomic bombs under development. The Enola Gay trained at Wendover before dropping Little Boy on Hiroshima on August 6, 1945. So behind the surviving hangars and weathered barracks is one of the most consequential stories in human history. The base declined after the war and was transferred to civilian control, leaving large sections abandoned. Wendover looks empty, but it is not silent in the historical sense. Every rusted door and faded building points toward the moment warfare gained the power to destroy a city in seconds. That power returned at Amchitka, a remote island in Alaska's Aleutian chain. American forces began constructing an airfield there in 1943 to oppose Japanese positions farther west. Around 14,000 personnel eventually occupied an island of mud, wind, fog, and violent storms. Engineers built runways, roads, housing, warehouses, and docks in conditions that seemed almost hostile to construction itself. The wartime base was reduced after Japan withdrew from the Aleutians, but Amchitka did not remain quiet. During the Cold War, the United States used the island for 3 underground nuclear tests. The largest, Kanakin, was detonated in 1971 with a yield of about 5 megatons, making it the biggest underground nuclear test in American history. So Amchitka was not merely abandoned once. It was built for one war, reused for another, contaminated, and left again. Empty buildings and twisted infrastructure still sit beneath low clouds, while radioactive material remains sealed deep underground. But even this is not the strangest abandoned war settlement in the Aleutians. That distinction belongs to Kiska. Japanese forces occupied Kiska in June 1942, turning part of American territory into a fortified island base. The occupation shocked the United States, so Allied aircraft bombed the island for more than a year. Military planners prepared a massive invasion called Operation Cottage, expecting a brutal fight against approximately 5,000 Japanese defenders. But under cover of fog, Japanese ships secretly evacuated 5,183 troops on July 28, 1943. The Allies did not realize they were gone. On August 15, more than 34,000 American and Canadian troops landed on Kiska. Fog reduced visibility, tension was extreme, and every movement looked like an ambush. But there was no enemy army waiting for them. Soldiers fired on one another, mines exploded, vehicles crashed, and men suffered from exposure and disease. The destroyer USS Abner Red struck a mine offshore, losing part of its stern and killing 71 sailors. More than 300 Allied casualties were suffered while capturing an island the Japanese had already abandoned. Afterward, the Americans expanded Kiska into a sprawling military settlement with roads, docks, huts, storage areas, and defensive positions. But the strategic threat had passed, so the base was soon deserted. Aircraft wreckage, rusting machinery, tunnels, bombs, and collapsed buildings still remain across the island. These ghost towns show that war does not only destroy communities, it can create them with astonishing speed, fill them with purpose, and erase them the moment that purpose disappears. Which of these abandoned places would you most want to explore? Share your choice, and stay with us for more forgotten corners of American history.